Shalom. This week we are reading Parshat Miketz, beginning in Genesis chapter 41. We're still reading about Yosef HaTzadik. In fact, in this week's Torah portion of Miketz, at the beginning of our portion, Pharaoh is dreaming and Yosef is still in prison. But very quickly, Yosef is catapulted to the very pinnacle of power. And what's more, it was given over to him by heaven to provide sustenance not only for his family, but ultimately for the entire land of Egypt. Yosef's brothers come down to Egypt to purchase food, and they have to deal with this seemingly harsh, very severe official. Throughout this parsha, Yosef chooses not to identify himself just yet to his brothers, but instead he orchestrates a very complex series of tests for his brothers to determine their level of solidarity to each other, their faith, and also to ascertain their true nature. But what about Yosef's relationship with his father Yaakov? The standard interpretation and understanding is that Yaakov long ago gave up his beloved son Yosef as dead and never expected to see him again. This is the way the verses seem to sound. Indeed, wasn't it just last week in Parshat Vayeshev that we read explicitly in chapter 37 regarding the whole incident of the sons coming with a coat dipped in blood? We read these verses. They dispatched the fine woolen tunic and brought it to their father and said, "We found this. Identify, if you please, is it your son's tunic or not?" He recognized it and he said, "My son's tunic, a savage beast devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to bits." Then Jacob rent his garments and placed sackcloth on his loins. He mourned for his son for many days. All his sons and all his daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "For I will go down to the grave mourning for my son." And his father bewailed him. And this certainly indicates to us very clearly that Yaakov assumed the worst, that Yosef was dead. Now, Rashi tells us that somehow, still in awe, Yaakov didn't have complete closure, because after all, there was no evidence. And Rashi tells us that he refused to be consoled because a person can't really be consoled for someone thinking that he's dead if he isn't really. So that already indicates to us that Yaakov was lacking some sort of closure. But actually, the same Rashi tells us something amazing. On these very verses from last week's Parsha, Rashi tells us that at that moment, somehow, there entered into Yaakov, into the patriarch Jacob, some sort of a flash of divine inspiration, some sort of muted, watered-down level of prophecy, albeit not clear. But Yaakov realized something was going on, and when he uttered these words, "A savage beast devoured him," Rashi says he really had some sort of a flash about what was going to happen regarding the temptation that Yosef was to face with his master's wife. And that these words, "a savage beast," actually refers to her. And this already seems to indicate that perhaps there is more beneath the surface, more between the lines that we read in the Torah regarding Yaakov's attitude about what really had happened. Indeed, there is a tradition, and Rashi refers to this here as well, that for whatever reason this was supposed to happen, Yaakov was not to know about it. Indeed, our sages teach us that even Yitzchak, Yosef's grandfather, was aware all those years that Yosef was truly alive. But the brothers, the holy brothers, the tribes of Jacob, they made some sort of an oath, of a pact, of a pledge between them. And the Holy One, blessed be He Himself, say our sages, was part of their pact, that Yaakov was not to know the truth about this. He wasn't supposed to know, so that whatever had to happen would happen for the good of the whole congregation of Israel. for the way that things would have to go down. But what does this really mean? This is very, very difficult to understand. And on the deepest levels, if we really study the words of our sages, and there are many, many indications of this that we can't cover completely now, but there are many, many indications that on some level, just as now from the very beginning, when he saw something about that savage beast, and when he refused to be consoled because there can't be closure for someone that's still alive, there are many indications throughout the verses themselves, as amplified by the understanding of our sages, that on some level, Yaakov indeed knew that it wasn't over, that this wasn't the whole story, that somehow Yosef was not dead. He knew something was wrong with the picture. He knew that he wasn't being told. He saw something. And you know, this really comes to a head right now in this week's Torah portion. In this week's Torah portion we find a very unusual 2 verses. It's the beginning of chapter 42 of our Parsha, Parshat Miketz. And there we read, in the very beginning of chapter 42, verse 1, Jacob saw that there were provisions in Egypt. He saw that there was food in Egypt. So Jacob said to his sons, "Why do you make yourselves conspicuous?" And verse 2 reads, and he said, "Behold, I have heard that there are provisions in Egypt. Go down there and purchase for us from there." So, verse 1 of chapter 42 begins with the expression Jacob saw, which actually here, in this particular Tanakh, is translated quite well as, and you'll see why, translated as he perceived, even though the word is Vayar Yaakov, which means a physical vision. Here it's translated based on the wisdom of our sages. He perceived, he saw in his mind's eye, he knew that there was food in Egypt. In Hebrew, shever, provisions. Vayar Yaakov ki yesh shever b'Mitzrayim. Yaakov saw, or more correctly perceived, that there was provisions, food in Egypt. But of all the words for the Torah to use, there are many words that describe food or provisions or grain. Shever is an unusual word. Also can be seen as referring to a break, to a crisis, to a trauma. And also as a play on words, the same letters can be pronounced sever, which is a form of a word meaning hope. In other words, our sages say, at this point, chapter 42 and verse 1 indicates a turning point in the level of clarity of Yaakov's prophecy. When Yaakov now saw that his sever, his hope, is in Egypt. This, our sages tell us, was another sparkling of a glass not so clear, a muted level of prophecy in which Yaakov began to see that Yosef indeed is in Egypt. And the more that we study the words of our sages, the more we realize that Yaakov consistently knew that something was up, and that it wasn't exactly as it appeared, the situation. He wasn't being told the truth. Somehow Yosef was still alive, and there are many more examples of this. Just last week again in Parshat Vayeshev, when Yosef was about to succumb to temptation with his master's wife, our sages tell us that he saw a vision of his father. His father's likeness came to him and chastised him. Our sages already painting for us a picture of some sort of spiritual bond and connection between Yaakov and Yosef that was never broken, and that somehow was maintained throughout the long years of separation. And so really, the question is, why? Why did Yaakov make like he did not know? What lesson do we learn from this? For whatever reason, the Holy One, blessed be He, His wisdom decreed that Yaakov was not to know. But Yaakov began to figure this picture out. He began to unravel all of the parts of the puzzle, and yet he was obliged to go along with a charade and not let on that he knew that Yosef was still alive. And there are so many levels of understanding and explanation within the whole mystery of Yaakov and Yosef. But I think that one of the most important and one of the deepest explanations that we can learn from for our lives regarding the relationship of Yaakov and Yosef has to do with one of the deepest ideas of a relationship between parents and children. You know, many times parents see that their children have to go through very difficult circumstances, very difficult trials and tests, and the parent naturally wishes, I wish I could go through what he has to go through for him. I wish I could do it for him. I wish I could just take care of it for him so that he doesn't have to deal with that. But we cannot live our children's lives, and we can't do it for them. And sometimes a parent, as painful as it may be, has to be somewhat passive, aware, and monitoring the situation and watching from a distance, just as we learned again in last week's Torah portion, those beautiful words, Va'aviv shamar et hadavar. We learned that when Yosef had his dreams, while Yaakov publicly chastised him for words that seemed to cause jealousy, evoke jealousy amongst his brothers, Va'aviv shamar et hadavar, the Torah testifies that his father actually kept the matter in mind. He was waiting and watching. And as Rashi tells us, he was waiting, when is this going to come true? And sometimes one has to watch from a distance because Hashem makes himself known and felt within each life and within the lives of each of our children as well. And as much as it hurt him, Yaakov knew that he could not intervene in the process that must take place between Yosef and Hashem, that Yosef would indeed make himself known, that Hashem would indeed make himself known to Yosef and manifest himself throughout his life on a very personal level, and that Yaakov was not going to be able to change what Yosef had to go through in Egypt and what Yosef would have to do in order to find Hashem in his own life, in order to find Hashem's purpose in his own life. And I think that this is a major lesson for all of us, that finding that purpose, the purpose that Hashem has for each of us in our lives, that cannot be done by a parent for a child. It can't be done in absentia or by proxy, because finding that purpose has to be left up to each and every one of us.